October 1944. The wind coming off the North Sea sliced through the flat Dutch coastline, carrying salt, cold, and the smell of death. Major Jack Morrison stood in a muddy trench, staring at a concrete fortress 200 meters away. Rain struck his helmet and ran down into the freezing water pooled at his boots. Behind him stood 34 wooden crosses. 34 Canadian soldiers had died in 3 days trying to take that single position. 34 families would soon receive telegrams saying their sons would never come home. The fortress rose from the seawall like a broken tooth, poured from reinforced concrete. Its walls were 12 feet thick on every side. Narrow firing slits cut through the structure, perfectly positioned to allow German machine guns to dominate every approach. The fort had been built in 1942 as part of the Atlantic Wall, designed not just to resist attack, but to make assault suicidal. Inside those walls, Major Klaus Richter commanded 180 Wehrmacht soldiers. They had food for weeks. They had deep ammunition reserves. They had 3 heavy artillery guns capable of destroying ships 15 kilometers away. 3 days earlier, Richter had sent a message to the Canadians. A Canadian lieutenant approached under a white flag, carrying a letter. The message was simple: surrender now, and your soldiers will be treated as prisoners of war. Continue, and you will be destroyed. The German response came back written in flawless English on expensive paper. I am a German officer. I do not negotiate with invaders. My soldiers will fight until the last bullet. You may lose many men trying to take this fortress. We will still be here when you give up and leave. That single fortress was holding up the entire Allied advance. 30 kilometers inland stood Antwerp, the second largest port in Europe. Through Antwerp, the Allies could move thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, food, and medicine every single day. Everything needed to end the war, but none of it could move while Richter controlled the Scheldt estuary. Every ship that tried to pass was destroyed by his guns. The Allies threw everything they had at the problem. British destroyers sailed close to shore and fired hundreds of shells directly into the concrete walls. Smoke and fire erupted. When it cleared, the fortress was still standing. The concrete was too thick. The shells simply shattered on the surface. American commanders proposed heavy bombers. Massive bombs could flatten the position. But German civilian homes still stood nearby. Families had lived there only weeks earlier. Bombing the fortress risked killing civilians. The order was refused. Canadian infantry attacked instead. The first assault came on a Sunday morning. 80 men advanced across open ground. German machine guns opened fire when they were 150 meters out. 23 Canadians died in the first 90 seconds. 19 more were wounded. The second assault came that evening under cover of smoke and grenades. 60 men pushed forward. The Germans waited until they were 50 meters away, then opened fire guided by sound. 24 more Canadians died. The third assault came the next day. Different tactics, artillery support. The result was the same. More crosses, more letters home, more failure. A British admiral arrived wearing a clean uniform and polished boots that had never seen mud. He spoke with confidence. The bombing would continue. Bigger guns would arrive. Eventually the concrete would crack. An American general agreed. More firepower, more men. That was how wars were won. The Canadian officers listening felt sick. That approach had already killed 34 of their men. Then winter weather closed in. Heavy storms grounded aircraft and froze naval operations. If the fortress was not taken before the storms arrived, the Allies would be forced to wait until spring. Every lost day meant thousands of tons of supplies stuck offshore. Every lost day meant more men dying at the front. Major Jack Morrison said nothing. He studied the maps spread beneath a lantern. 29 years old, a former deep-sea sailor from Newfoundland, a man who understood ships, explosives, and the moods of the ocean. And while generals argued about guns and bombs, Morrison noticed something they had completely ignored: the tide. If you want to understand how one overlooked detail changed the fate of an entire campaign, make sure you subscribe now. What comes next is not about firepower. It is about understanding nature itself. Major Jack Morrison waited for the tide charts to confirm what his instincts already told him. The Scheldt estuary was not just water. It was a living system, governed by currents, moon cycles, and shallow channels that shifted with the seasons. Twice a day, the sea withdrew farther than anyone expected, exposing mudflats that stretched for hundreds of meters along the coast. Mudflats that no fortress gun could fully cover. The German garrison had designed their defenses to stop ships and frontal assaults. Their firing angles were calculated for open water and dry land. But the charts showed something else. At extreme low tide, a narrow corridor emerged along the seawall, hidden beneath water most of the day. It was unstable, knee-deep in mud, and impossible for vehicles. But infantry could cross it if they moved slowly, silently, and at exactly the right moment. Morrison brought the idea to his superiors. At first, they dismissed it. Senior officers laughed at the thought of men crawling through freezing mud under enemy guns. Others argued the soldiers would drown, be spotted, or arrive too exhausted to fight. No manual recommended attacking a concrete fortress through tidal sludge in the middle of a North Sea winter. But Morrison persisted. He explained that the Germans believed the mud itself was protection. No patrols watched it closely. No machine gun nests were aimed low enough. The defenders trusted concrete and firepower. They trusted that no one would be reckless enough to try what nature itself seemed to forbid. Finally, permission was granted for a limited operation, not a full assault, a test. Morrison selected a small group of volunteers, experienced men, quiet men, soldiers who understood that failure meant not retreat, but death in silence. They blackened their equipment, wrapped metal to prevent noise, and memorized the tide window down to the minute. They moved just before dawn. The wind howled across the estuary, masking sound. Rain stung their faces. As the water receded, the men stepped into mud so cold it burned. Each movement required effort. Each step threatened to pull a boot free and leave a man stuck. The fortress loomed above them, silent and immovable. German sentries looked outward, toward the sea and the open approaches. They did not look down. The Canadians advanced for hours, inch by inch, bodies soaked, muscles shaking. Several men nearly collapsed. One slipped and vanished to his waist, dragged free only by the grip of another soldier. Still, no alarm sounded. When they reached the base of the seawall, Morrison signaled a halt. Explosives were placed carefully, pressed against seams where concrete met stone. These were not massive charges meant to destroy the fortress. They were precise, surgical. At exactly the moment the tide began to turn, Morrison gave the order. The explosions were sharp and controlled, echoing across the water like cracks of thunder. Smoke rose. Concrete fractured. For the first time in days, the fortress reacted. German soldiers rushed to firing positions, confused and disoriented. They expected another frontal attack. Instead, Canadians were already inside the dead angles of the guns. The breach did not end the fight, but it changed everything. For the first time, the fortress was vulnerable, and Major Klaus Richter realized, too late, that the enemy had not beaten his walls. They had gone around his certainty. The assault did not begin with gunfire. It began with silence. In the early hours before dawn, when the tide had retreated farther than anyone expected, The sea itself pulled back like a curtain. Where water should have been, there was only mud, channels, and slick black earth stretching all the way to the base of the fortress. The Germans inside did not notice. They were watching the sea, not the ground beneath it. Major Jack Morrison led the first group forward without orders, shouted or signals fired. Men moved slowly, carefully, carrying equipment wrapped in cloth to silence every sound. Boots sank into the mud. Cold water soaked through uniforms. No one complained. They knew this was their only chance. As they advanced, the massive guns of the fortress remained angled toward the open water, waiting for ships that would never come. The firing slits, so deadly from the front, were useless against an enemy moving along the exposed seabed below them. For the first time in days, the concrete walls were blind. Morrison reached the base of the fortress and pressed his hand against the cold surface. He could feel vibrations from inside, voices, movement. The Germans were awake, just unaware. Explosives were placed methodically, not to destroy the fortress, but to open it. Charges were set at ventilation shafts, maintenance access points, and structural seams exposed by the low tide. Every placement was calculated. Every second mattered. When the first charge detonated, it was not a roar, but a deep, controlled shock. Concrete cracked. Dust rolled upward. Alarms began to sound inside the fortress, confused and delayed. German soldiers rushed to firing positions that no longer mattered. Canadian troops poured through the openings before resistance could organize. Fighting inside was brief, chaotic, and disorienting. Smoke filled corridors. Orders echoed off concrete walls. The fortress that had resisted everything from the sea collapsed from within. Major Klaus Richter realized too late what had happened. The sea he trusted had betrayed him. Within hours, white flags appeared where machine guns had once ruled. One by one, German soldiers emerged, weapons lowered, stunned by how quickly the impossible had happened. The fortress had not been destroyed. It had been taken. By mid-morning, the guns that had blocked the Scheldt estuary for weeks were silent. Engineers moved in immediately, disabling artillery and signaling to the fleet waiting offshore. For the first time since the campaign began, ships started moving again. Fuel flowed. Ammunition followed. Food, medicine, and reinforcements poured through Antwerp in volumes never before possible. The Allied advance, once stalled, surged forward with renewed force. What weeks of bombardment could not achieve, one understanding of nature had accomplished in a single night. Major Jack Morrison did not celebrate. He stood on the seawall, watching the tide return, water covering the same ground that had made victory possible only hours earlier. The ocean erased the evidence, as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The war would move faster now. Lives would be saved, because one man had looked at the battlefield differently, and 34 wooden crosses would not need company. The assault came not with thunder, but with silence. Before dawn, as cold fog rolled in from the North Sea, the tide began to rise exactly as Major Jack Morrison had predicted. The water crept slowly across the mudflats, swallowing the ground where Canadian soldiers had died days earlier. German observers inside the fortress watched calmly. High tide had come and gone before. They believed the sea was their ally. They were wrong. Hidden beneath the surface, Canadian engineers moved with the water. Small boats, barely visible in the fog, drifted toward the seawall without engines, without noise. The tide carried them forward like ghosts. By the time German sentries realized something was wrong, the water was already lapping against the lower firing slits. For the first time since the fighting began, the fortress was blind. Machine gun positions designed to dominate open land could not depress low enough to fire into the flooded approach. Artillery crews struggled as seawater poured into access tunnels. Ammunition crates floated. Communications failed. Inside the concrete walls, order began to fracture. That was the moment Morrison had waited for. Canadian infantry advanced behind the tide, moving through knee-deep water instead of open ground. There was no charge, no shouting, only steady movement forward. Explosives were placed precisely where the water pressure weakened the structure most. Not brute force, understanding. When the charges detonated, they did not destroy the fortress. They opened it. Breaches formed along the lower walls, forcing German soldiers upward into cramped interior corridors. Smoke filled the concrete chambers. For the first time in days, the defenders were reacting instead of controlling the fight. Major Klaus Richter understood the truth before his men did. The fortress had not been defeated by superior firepower. It had been defeated by time, tide, and patience. Richter ordered his officers to gather. Ammunition was ruined. Artillery was useless. Escape was impossible. Continuing the fight would mean death without purpose. Shortly after sunrise, a white flag appeared above the broken concrete. Canadian soldiers emerged from the water exhausted, frozen, and stunned by what they were seeing. The fortress that had killed so many of their friends stood silent. German soldiers filed out slowly, weapons lowered, faces pale and hollow. The Scheldt estuary was open. Within days, Allied ships began moving freely toward Antwerp. Fuel flowed. Food arrived. Ammunition reached the front. What had been delayed for weeks now moved in unstoppable volume. Entire armies advanced because one position had finally fallen. Major Jack Morrison never gave a victory speech. He did not claim credit. When asked how he solved the problem, he gave a simple answer. The sea was always going to decide this. Someone just had to listen. The battle for the fortress never became famous. It did not produce a headline general or a dramatic photograph, but its impact echoed across the final months of the war. Sometimes history is not changed by louder guns. Sometimes it is changed by the man who notices what everyone else ignores.